Charles Ponzi wasn't a genius. He wasn't a sophisticated financier or a strategic mastermind. In fact, many historians argue he barely understood the mechanics of the financial system he manipulated. And yet, in the early 20th century, this Italian immigrant managed to create one of the most notorious and influential scams in history. A scam so devastating that his name is now eternally linked with financial fraud. The Ponzi scheme promised astronomical returns with little to no risk, tapping into the hopes and desperation of post-World War I Americans. It was a mirage that captivated the masses and made Ponzi temporarily rich and globally infamous. This is not just the story of a con. It's a warning about blind greed, unchecked ambition, and how even the most absurd lies can thrive in the right environment. Carlo Pietro Giovanni Guglielmo Tebaldo Ponzi, later known simply as Charles Ponzi, was born in Lugo, Italy in 1882 into a once wealthy family that had fallen into hardship. From an early age, Ponzi showed signs of grand imagination and restlessness. He immigrated to the United States in 1903 with dreams of becoming rich, but without a solid plan or education. What he did have was charm, ambition, and an unshakable belief that he was destined for greatness. Ponzi bounced from job to job, dishwasher, waiter, clerk, and even served jail time for forgery in Canada. Yet each failure only seemed to fuel his appetite for fortune. Desperate to rise above his immigrant status and make his mark, he would soon stumble upon an idea that would grant him fame, fortune, and eventual infamy. In 1919, while working a mundane job and still chasing financial success, Ponzi came across an obscure postal instrument called the International Reply Coupon, IRC. These coupons allowed someone in one country to pay the cost of return postage for a letter sent to another country, essentially a tool to facilitate international correspondence. Ponzi, in a moment of misguided inspiration, believed he had discovered a golden loophole. He theorized that due to differences in currency values after World War I, he could buy IRCs cheaply in European countries suffering from inflation, send them to the US, redeem them for more valuable American postage, stamps, and then sell those stamps for profit. On paper, it seemed clever, an arbitrage opportunity exploiting currency fluctuations. But in reality, the profit margins were minuscule, the logistics impossible, and the entire idea unscalable. Ponzi either failed to understand or willfully ignored these limitations. Instead of admitting the plan's impracticality, he transformed it into a selling point. He would promise investors massive returns based on this supposed international stamp arbitrage. The truth was, Ponzi wasn't conducting large-scale trades of IRCs. He was simply taking money from new investors to pay the old ones. And with that, the infamous Ponzi scheme was born. In late 1919, Charles Ponzi officially founded the Securities Exchange Company in Boston, claiming he had developed a revolutionary investment method based on IRCs. He offered a seductive deal: 50% profit in just 45 days, or 100% in 90 days. A return rate that defied all economic logic. But in a time of economic instability, post-war desperation, and limited financial education, his promises seemed like a miracle. People lined up outside his office to hand over their savings. Ponzi used money from new investors to pay off the earlier ones, creating the illusion of success. As word spread, more people bought into the lie. Even as questions arose about how he was making such incredible profits, Ponzi deflected with confidence, charisma, and lavish displays of wealth. By mid-1920, he was raking in hundreds of thousands of dollars per day, living in a mansion, and being hailed in newspapers as a financial wizard. No one realized they were standing on a financial time bomb that could only be sustained as long as new money kept pouring in. By the summer of 1920, Charles Ponzi had become a national sensation. Newspapers dubbed him the financial messiah of Boston, and thousands of ordinary Americans rushed to invest their life savings with him. The frenzy was unlike anything the city had seen. Teachers, janitors, widows, and even police officers took out loans to invest in Ponzi's scheme, encouraged by friends who had already received their so-called profits. The sheer volume of money flowing into the Securities Exchange Company was staggering. On some days, Ponzi collected over $1 million, equivalent to tens of millions today. What fueled the madness wasn't just greed, it was trust. Ponzi appeared generous, charming, and confident. He wore expensive suits, donated to charities, and paid investors promptly. His image became untouchable, and skepticism was drowned out by mass hysteria. Banks and journalists who questioned the legitimacy of his scheme were ignored or publicly ridiculed. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Ponzi was drowning in paperwork, hiding the fact that there were no real investments and that the entire empire was funded by the faith of his followers and the constant inflow of new money. Despite the overwhelming hype, cracks in Ponzi's operation started to form. Some journalists and financial experts began to do the math, and it didn't add up. The scale of IRC arbitrage Ponzi claimed was logistically impossible. Investigative journalist Richard Grozier from the Boston Post launched a series of probing articles in July 1920, questioning how Ponzi could legally and sustainably generate such profits. At the same time, federal and state authorities began their own investigations, including audits by the U.S. Post Office and the Massachusetts Bank Commissioner. As scrutiny intensified, nervous investors started demanding their money back. Though Ponzi initially paid them off to maintain appearances, the pressure mounted. The Hanover Trust Bank, which Ponzi had once bailed out and even tried to buy, began to fear collapse. Financial experts concluded that for Ponzi's IRC arbitrage plan to be real, there would need to be millions of IRCs in circulation. But only a few dozen were actually being used. By August 1920, the illusion was crumbling fast. The fraud, once unstoppable, was now a runaway train heading for destruction. By mid-August 1920, Charles Ponzi's empire came crashing down with the same breathtaking speed at which it had risen. After weeks of intense investigations, the truth could no longer be contained. The Boston Post published damning evidence that Ponzi was insolvent and that his so-called profits were nothing more than payouts from new investors. The panic spread like wildfire. Crowds of angry people gathered outside his office, demanding their money back. Banks, once eager to work with him, froze his accounts. Auditors revealed a staggering shortfall. Ponzi owed about $7 million to investors, but only had $1.5 million in assets. On August 12, 1920, Ponzi was arrested and charged with multiple counts of mail fraud. The public, who once praised him as a genius, now turned on him with rage and disbelief. The government seized his property, his companies, and everything he had acquired during his short-lived reign. The Securities Exchange Company was declared bankrupt, and thousands of investors, many of them working-class citizens, were left financially devastated. In just under a year, Charles Ponzi had built and destroyed one of the largest financial schemes in history, all while barely understanding the economic principles he claimed to master. Following his arrest, Ponzi's trial became a national spectacle. Despite facing 86 counts of mail fraud, Ponzi remained bizarrely confident. He pled guilty to a single federal charge, hoping for leniency. In November 1920, he was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. But his legal troubles didn't end there. After serving just over 3 years, he was immediately indicted by Massachusetts for state-level crimes. Ponzi, ever the showman, acted as his own attorney during some of these proceedings, and even cross-examined witnesses with theatrical flair. However, the courts weren't amused. In 1925, he was sentenced to an additional 7 to 9 years in state prison. His appeals dragged on for years, but justice ultimately caught up with him. The man who once fooled thousands and lived like royalty was now shackled in a prison uniform. Yet, even in disgrace, Ponzi didn't show remorse. He seemed almost proud of the scale of his deception, famously declaring, "My business is simple. It's the old game of robbing Peter to pay Paul." With that, Charles Ponzi sealed his place in history, not as a genius, but as the most infamous financial fool who ever lived. After serving time in federal and state prisons, Charles Ponzi's once glamorous life was reduced to shambles. In 1934, following his release, U.S. immigration authorities deemed him an undesirable alien. He was deported back to Italy, the country he had left in search of the American dream. Ponzi arrived in a changed Europe, struggling economically and under the growing shadow of fascism. Desperate to reclaim some relevance, he tried launching new ventures, including a bizarre scheme involving land development in Mussolini's Italy, but none succeeded. Eventually, Ponzi accepted a job managing an airline company in Brazil, another failed venture that collapsed under corruption and mismanagement. By the 1940s, he was broke, sick, and utterly forgotten. He lived his final years in a charity hospital in Rio de Janeiro, partially blind and paralyzed from a stroke, surviving on donations from a few sympathizers who still remembered his name. On January 18, 1949, Charles Ponzi died in obscurity, with barely enough money for a proper burial. The man who once juggled millions died with 75 sols to his name, proving that even the boldest con has an expiration date. Though Ponzi himself died penniless and disgraced, his name lived on, etched into economic history as the originator of one of the most infamous scams of all time. The Ponzi scheme has since become a textbook example of fraudulent investment operations. It describes any system that pays returns to earlier investors using funds contributed by new investors, without any legitimate business activity behind it. His formula was copied, most notably by Bernie Madoff, whose $65 billion fraud dwarfed Ponzi's, but followed the same basic deception. Ironically, Ponzi's legacy serves as both a warning and a blueprint, a reminder of how easily people can be manipulated when greed, desperation, and blind trust converge. Regulators now use his case to build laws and systems that monitor financial fraud, yet Ponzi-style scams continue to reappear around the world. The enduring appeal of too good to be true promises proves that while the faces may change, the con remains the same. In the end, Charles Ponzi didn't just scam people, he defined an entire category of financial crime. At the core of Charles Ponzi's story lies not just financial fraud, but a revealing portrait of a pathological conman. Ponzi wasn't an educated economist or a mastermind of complex systems. He was, in many ways, a dangerously persuasive fool. But what he lacked in intelligence, he made up for in charm, confidence, and narcissism. He possessed an uncanny ability to make people trust him, often using a combination of flattery, fast talk, and exaggerated promises. Psychologists and historians alike have studied Ponzi's behavior as a classic case of narcissistic personality disorder, marked by an inflated sense of self-importance, a need for admiration, and a complete disregard for the truth. What's striking is that Ponzi may have believed parts of his own lies. Like many con artists, he didn't just deceive others, he deceived himself. He rationalized his actions, painted himself as a visionary, and even after the collapse, never fully accepted responsibility. Instead, he continued to brag about the scale of his fraud, as if size alone was an achievement. His behavior reminds us that scams are often fueled less by brilliant planning and more by reckless arrogance and emotional manipulation. Ponzi wasn't just scamming banks. He was performing for the crowd and convincing himself that the applause was real. Charles Ponzi's legacy is both absurd and terrifying. He wasn't a financial genius. He was, by many accounts, a financial idiot who didn't even understand the mechanics of the scheme that bore his name. Yet for a brief, dangerous moment in history, he captivated the world and nearly brought a city's economy to its knees. What made his story so devastating wasn't the sophistication of his scam, it was its simplicity. He promised people what they wanted to hear, and in doing so, exposed a universal vulnerability. Our willingness to believe in miracles when reason fails us. More than a century later, Ponzi's shadow still looms over financial markets. His name is invoked every time a new fraud emerges. His story continues to be a cautionary tale taught in business schools, cited in courtrooms, and examined in documentaries. But beyond the headlines and criminal records, Ponzi's tale is a reminder of a darker truth, that greed can blind, charm can deceive, and even the most foolish man can shake the world if we stop asking questions. And that's the true danger Ponzi left behind.